Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you all for joining us today. We are going to discuss managing your Asia supply chain, and we are so grateful to have Kim Kirkendall here with us today, who's going to give us an in-depth view on some things that are going on in Asia regarding supply chain disruption, and maybe give us some ways to mitigate and go about working within that region of the world. Just to give you a little bit of background, Kim is the president of International Resource Development Incorporated and has been a bridge between the US and China for over 30 years. She started her career in operations, manufacturing, and supply chain, and finally became a CPA and started her own business as a consultant, both as interim executive for some companies, as CFO, VP of operations, and general manager, and as an advisor for others. So we're very grateful to have Kim with us here today. Very excited to hear what she's going to talk about. Just some general housekeeping instructions. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, while Kim is talking, if you wouldn't mind entering those in the chat function, I will be checking those periodically and try to get back to you. And then at the end, we will have a Q&A with Kim for specific questions to her. There will be a survey that's going to go out to you at the end of the presentation. So if you wouldn't mind filling that out and returning that back to us as soon as you can, that's very important for our record keeping. And then we will also send a copy of the recording as well as a copy of the presentation to you guys after the end of the presentation. So without further ado, I don't want to keep anybody from this great information. We're going to go ahead and get started. Kim, if you would like to take over.
Thank you very much, Julia. I appreciate it. Good afternoon, everyone. I thank you for taking this time to take a look at what's happening in the Asian supply chain right now with virus disruption, of course, layered on top of the trade war that's been ongoing now for a couple of years. So we're going to look at travel and work restrictions in Asia, and I'm going to focus on China, Vietnam, like a few countries and specifics in most of this, but we'll look more broadly at what's impacting the region. What are the supply chain problems that we're seeing with suppliers, logistics, customs? And then lastly, what can you do to secure your supply chain? You know, supplier management, how you can get to the truth, which is an issue when you're not able to travel back and forth. And then how this, both the trade war as well as the virus are showing companies where in your operations and procedures you have weaknesses. And then a final kind of urgent recap reminder. If you have any questions, please hold those to the end, and I look forward to helping you with whatever I can. So we're going to start with travel and work restrictions. So right now, most of the countries in Asia are on one of two kinds of lockdown. Either they're still allowing some foreign visitors, but there's a mandatory 14-day government quarantine. In many cases, there's restrictions on what type of visa visitors are allowed in the country. The screenshot on the right is China's announcement from the end of March that suspended all foreign travel visas into the country, including residence and residence permits. So if you wanted to travel to China as it stands right now, you need to get a new temporary visa. Once this restriction has been lifted, then the current visas will be allowed again. They may phase that in, we don't know. But even if you were to get the new temporary visa, it's still mandatory to do a 14-day quarantine at a facility that the government provides at your own expense. In Vietnam, you can quarantine at home or in a hotel. They do check on you regularly. You have to put updates regularly. They've also restricted what types of visitors can come into the country. South Korea is the same. Other Asian countries have basically banned all entry from foreign countries. India, Japan, Thailand, have banned it completely. If they, even their own national citizens and in many cases. So in addition to that, moving within each country can be restricted. You need to show additional paperwork. You may need to show that you've been tested. There are apps in some countries that have been rolled out that will give you a green, a yellow, or a red sign, so that if you're on the subway or walking through the street and you need to provide that app and you don't have a green, you only have a yellow or a red, you may be turned around or penalized. So within the countries, there's still travel restrictions. They're slowly easing up, even within a district of a city. So Ho Chi Minh, Saigon in southern Vietnam, recently allowed, it's broken up into segments of the city. You have 1, 2, 3, they're numbered and everyone uses those. So some of those numbers have been allowed to, some of them were on lockdown in their own homes and they've been allowed to walk around their neighborhood, and some others can now go from one neighborhood to another. So just be very careful, even in the next couple of months, as you start considering traveling again, to see whether or not what the restrictions are in that country. Supply chain problems, we'll look at suppliers first, supplier management. Most factories are back to work in mid and large size companies in China. Vietnam, there's some factories back at work, others are still not, have not been allowed to reopen. Even as factories are reopening, you need to think that they don't have their normal workforce. So they may be relying on workers who come from a different province. It may still be difficult to travel from that province where their family is to the province where they've been working. And so the company may have to have hired temporary workers, which I would call a less desirable pool of workers. So they didn't have their normal choice of who to employ on the plant floor or in the shop or whatever the circumstance was. So that creates some disruption in how well trained those employees are, how reliable they are. They're certainly not long-term employees in most cases. So that means ongoing disruptions in the labor pool. Many companies may have cash flow issues. They've lost revenue, but their overhead continues. So that leads us to question how their financial health is. If their financial health is a greater concern than it was maybe a year ago or 3 years ago. And when you add in the other stressors that were there before, so if your suppliers or customers, there's an aging owner who doesn't have a clear transition to the next generation or plan for getting out of that company, the trade war might have disrupted their sales, either in Vietnam's case, or Thailand or Malaysia, maybe it increased sales at your partners there because people were switching out of China, and China, maybe they lost sales. And then poor management issues. There's a lot of stressors on companies, and hopefully you know what those are for your partners in Asia. And I would expect those to be worse now. There to be more pressure on management, there to be less flexibility, more cash flow issues than there were before. Most of the governments in Asia are offering help to companies in low cost or interest-free loans, cash, especially to SMEs, which is not always typical in many of these countries. So, are they taking advantage of that? There's also been delays on when you have to pay payroll taxes in some countries. So are they taking advantage of those things? How does that impact you in any way? Overall, I would remind you to be a good partner or employer, customer, whatever that relationship is. This is the time to be kind, to be clear, but to be firm and to be prepared. So you want to make it clearer than you should always make it clear, but especially in this circumstance. What are your critical needs, in working with that partner? What do you expect from them? How often do you want information? If they had to choose between 2 purchase orders, which one would you want them to prioritize? So you need to be very, very clear right now and not allow for any kind of guesswork. I had a client the last few days that their factory in China is being run by a very young general manager who had worked for them in the US. And their sales increased dramatically in the last 3 months, which is wonderful, except it put them into a terrible cash flow position. They didn't have enough cash to buy all the raw materials to support the new sales. Without telling the American side, this Chinese general manager borrowed money from a partner of theirs in another business they have in China to the tune of $150,000 US dollars. So quite a lot of money to borrow. You know, in her mind, it was a 10-day until the US could fill the cash flow gap. But the US isn't in a position to fill that cash flow gap for a variety of reasons, and partly what's going on here in their US company and the difficulty of getting money into China and getting it back out again. So now they, you know, the president of the US company had to put a call into that partner in China and say, hey, I didn't know, right? Didn't know that my company was borrowing money from you. Thank you, by the way. And then try to figure out now how to get a better solution for that cash flow. So you really need to be on top of every aspect of the order and your business, things that you normally would have said, you know, we've had this company for 10 years, we've had this partner for 5 years. I don't need to worry about this. You know, it's always worked before. That's a red flag for me when someone says we never had a problem with that before, because that tells me you've taken your eye off of that, right? It's you've lowered your concern level. And that from an internal fraud standpoint means there's a higher chance of internal fraud in that area. And mismanagement, it doesn't have to be intentional fraud. It can be a bad decision, right? People make bad decisions with the best of intentions. So supply chain problems. This is an overused word, but I'm using it anyways. It's a very fluid situation in logistics. There's every few days, if not every week, there's a different part of the logistics chain that's struggling. So trucking in the US had been going through a lot of consolidation over the last few years. Companies went out of business. There weren't enough truck drivers. And then you have, you know, everybody kind of commerce stopping for a period of time. China not shipping anything to the US when they were on shutdown. And then as they started to come back and started shipping to us, then the US was on shutdown and we were canceling orders. So there's been disruptions in the US in the trucking industry. And in China, there's still restrictions on traveling from province to province. They have to show their documents and paperwork. Are the truckers ready to go back to work? Are the trucks where they need to be to transport goods? So the ground transportation side of things is still not, you know, is not what I would call back to normal and probably won't be for months. Air freight, as you know, many commercial passenger flights have been canceled, and there was a lot of cargo going in the bellies of those planes. Cargo flights have been canceled. So there's an overall reduction in capacity that is impacting a lot of business. Again, China was on a downturn. It suddenly peaked back up again with manufacturing. All these goods came into the, you know, wanted to be shipped to the US, and now we'll get to ocean freight. Many of the freight companies, ocean companies had issued blank vessels. They just basically taken ships out of the transportation chain. And then maybe there's even worse than normal, empty containers, you know, in the wrong ports, not where they're needed, and they have to be moved. So, you know, both in air freight and ocean freight, you have still a tremendous amount of disruption. The other area that I would highlight is warehousing, because again, when China came back up to speed and started suddenly shipping all these delayed orders over to the US, they landed in the US in various ports at about the same time that US companies were saying, we don't need that anymore, right? Our businesses are slowing down. So a lot of the warehouses at the port suddenly became, whether it's the airport or the ocean port, suddenly became overloaded. And your goods might be stuck in the middle of that warehouse somewhere and hard for somebody to get out. So you need to be super flexible and creative right now and not assume that if you always brought it into Long Beach and you trucked it into Minneapolis and you break bulk in Minneapolis, that's going to work for you today. That may not work for you. It may be better to actually ocean freight it to the East Coast and then train it over, you know. So you've got to look at each part of that logistics chain and see how it's, you know, this is where your freight forwarder comes in handy, or your internal staff, to ask them, we need to see what the wait times are, you know, what the availability is. We need to look at multiple options right now. So it's still very disrupted. I expect it to be disrupted for at least overall for at least 6 months or longer. Customs and trade. So both the Asian countries and US Customs are on a heightened alert right now. This whole thing with PPE is, if you follow me on LinkedIn, if you don't, you should, because it's amusing. But I have been writing articles on PPE that basically say, just don't, please don't get into this. Because people that do this for a living, that manage supply chain for a living, and suppliers and vendors in China wouldn't touch it with the 10-foot pole. The people I see jumping into it are people that are new to this, or are doing trade in other industries or other countries. They're new to trading in general. It is next to impossible to validate the supplier in China is legitimate, that they're using the paperwork they're giving you applies to the factory that's making those goods. And so Chinese customs has been rushing to adapt to, okay, you guys want a lot of PPE, we'll make sure it gets there. Oh, wait, you're getting poor quality. All right, we'll crack down on the manufacturers. Oh, now you're getting, product that fails. Well, now we're going to 100% inspect everything before it leaves. So Vietnam has also put restrictions on what's going between China and Vietnam, what's leaving Vietnam to the US and coming in. So there's just a lot of ancillary trade and customs barriers that are happening right now at ports of entry and export that are slowing down clearance that you need to be aware of. And again, it's not just those intentional decisions, but the unintentional outcome of the vessels and the planes being disrupted. They ramp up to a full workforce, and then they don't have enough equipment going in and out, so they lay some of those people off. And then some people get sick, or they don't want to come in, or they take other jobs. So there's been these peaks and valleys of how goods are hitting, the vessels and the borders, and then how the staff are coming in and out of those positions. So again, it's a very, you can't assume that next week is going to operate like this week does, or that a month from now is going to operate like today does. So you need to be very cautious. I've had clients breaking shipments up into multiple shipments to multiple ports, leaving from multiple ports, coming into multiple ports. It's more expensive. But then if one or two of those should get stuck or delayed, you've at least got the product that you want. I did the same. I brought in some masks a month ago before the validity of them started to fall apart. And I still, at that point, a month ago, had them sent from 4 different locations via 4 different couriers: DHL, FedEx, US Postal Service, and TNT. And each one like 150, 200 pieces each. I just brought in 1,000 to donate, to nursing homes and stuff. And even then, one of those shipments got held up out of Shanghai. So you just cannot rely on business as usual. And so you need to be very, very cautious and innovative. Let's see, we'll go to the next one. Other steps to secure your supply chain: supplier management. Part of being in touch with your supplier regularly is you want to find out what's their return to work status. It varies by city. It varies within the country, within a city. So with your supplier, they are returned to work. They have in China, they have forms that they have to display that they've been approved to return to work. They have to have certain policies and procedures in place at the factory, that they're taking temperatures, that they have breaks for cleaning the factory for people to wash their hands, that anyone that's returned to that city can't come into the workplace until they've 14 days self-quarantined. So when you communicate with your partners, in Asia, how knowledgeable are they about these procedures that are going on? How confident do they sound? Can they show you the documents that they have, that they have been approved to return to work, that they're taking it seriously? And then the next issue is, what about their sub-suppliers? Are they getting the raw materials they need? Who are their suppliers? Where's that product coming from? And then, from a logistics shipping standpoint, and then financial. What kind of payment terms are they on with those suppliers? Are those suppliers operational? Are their sub-suppliers operational? These are all things that, we recommend when we do vendor qualifications, to look into a lot of these things. And if you have that information of what the normal status is, then you can probe on how it's acting right now. If you don't have that information, then this is a good time to get it. And then how is their cash flow? Cash flow, cash flow, cash flow. It's a huge issue right now with a lot of companies, whether their business is ramping up suddenly and they need a lot of cash, or it's slow and they don't have the sales they normally have. So it's more critical than ever to understand that. And not every country, Vietnam is very similar to China. Thailand is a little more open. Singapore is more open, although you really don't find manufacturing there. They're typically across the border in Malaysia or in Indonesia. But what is their banking situation? Are they able to get operating capital loans, from the banks? Many countries can't. Many banks in a lot of the more government hierarchical countries do asset-based lending. They don't do operating capital loans in the same way. China is an example of that, Vietnam as well. So in those environments, they use what we call shadow lending. Shadow lending is a less regulated non-bank lending platform. And in China, that accounts for between $5 and $7 trillion of loans. So a lot of, if not the majority of businesses in China that do borrow money, borrow it from the shadow lending market because you can't get it from the banks. So that shadow lending market, the average interest rate is 20 to 25%. And they can go up to 40 and 45% if you can't guarantee your loans. 20 and 25% is with some type of a guarantee by an individual who has assets if the company doesn't. And some of these shadow lending, it can be trust companies, it can be credit unions, they can be somewhat formal, they can be loan sharks. So there's micro lending falls into this, a lot of different lending in the shadow lending. So how are your partners financing their business? How well are people communicating and staying on task? You really need to look at, between your staff in the US and the staff in China, how are they communicating right now? Because if it's difficult on a normal day, it's going to be impossible today. With people working from home and fewer opportunities to really communicate your priorities in the same way. So you need to make sure that you're giving extremely clear instructions and direction about, this is critical, this is non-critical, this is my expected date, this is what information I need from you and when I need it and how I need it. So that's very important on both your US and your Asian partner side. And again, act like a good partner. You don't want to be hostile. You don't want to be angry. This is nobody's fault. Everybody's under the same amount of pressure that we feel like we're under right now. And this is a great time to create or restore or reinforce the binds of those relationships that you have to get you through this time and into the next time. Get to the truth. I get this a lot lately, and it's true of all the time, but especially lately when everyone's under a lot of pressure and you want to hold off on a shipment, or you need to accelerate a shipment, you need to accelerate payment. It's difficult to get what Americans would consider a straight answer. A lot of what we hear, when we ask, can you ship it on October 15th? The yes answer that we hear, or we can do that, a lot of that is what I call aspirational lying. And everyone does aspirational lying. It's just a matter of in what types of relationships and situations that we do it. Aspirational lying is when someone tells you what they hope to be true. And many times they believe that it's true, or they believe that they can do what they need to do to get to that point. We don't do it as much in business in this country because we're a very litigious society. And if you mislead or tell someone, yes, we can deliver this, and then you can't, they can sue you, right? China and Vietnam and a lot of other Asian countries are not as litigation based as we are. So in those countries, it's more common to do it not only in your personal life, but also in your business life, where you tell someone what you want to be the case, and then if it doesn't happen, culturally you expect them to know that you were trying and you just couldn't make it work, right? And Americans typically see a yes commitment as 100%, I'm absolutely sure I can do it, not I'm 60% I can do it, I'm going to try my best and we'll see, right? Which is really what it means a lot of the time. So how do you verify information in this kind of an environment? You want to use objective measures. You want to use photos and videos and material certifications and inventory records and their raw material suppliers' delivery notices, and whatever you can get that is not offensive to your partners, that you can, and you have a good reason to ask for something like that, then that type of data and information can tell you where are they in the production process, or where are they in the selling process. Because if they had sold what they should have sold at this point, our distributor, then their inventory would be at this amount, and it's not, it's too high, or it's too low, or whatever. And using multiple forms of information that you can cross-check against each other is even better. So this is that incremental indirect data, material orders, inventory levels, that kind of thing. So in this situation, what I try to do with clients, and again, I have another client recently that they wanted to, the US company was considering whether to keep that factory they have in China open or shut it down, or how they were going to manage it. And they came to me and they said, well, we're not too worried about terminating employees. We terminated a few people last year. And I said, again, that is not today. In the post-virus situation, the Chinese government is very indisposed to companies terminating people because they want to keep employment up. And there's more scrutiny and pressure on foreign companies and what you're doing, that you're not pulling out of China and leaving your liabilities unpaid. So I want to see the employment contracts. And then again, if you want to terminate a senior manager and your factory in China doesn't send you copies of their employment contracts, to suddenly ask for their contract out of the blue is a little weird. And many companies don't get the employment contracts as they're signed every year. So it's just a good time to say, hey, our bank or our chairman of the board or our shareholders, or we're doing a revamp of our procedures right now because we're all working remotely. So we went through a checklist of information we need from you, and it includes, bank statements and this and this and this, and it includes employment contracts. Then you get all the employment contracts that way, right? So sometimes you have to be creative about how you ask for this information so that you're not alerting them to the reason you're asking for it, so that you have a higher confidence that you're getting the information you want. When I did this with this supplier, we found out that they're using a third-party payroll agency, which is a whole long story for China. But in this instance, the first 50 employees that were brought into this business when it opened a few years ago are on contract and working for this employment agency. The next group of 45 employees that were brought on, this employment agency did not sign contracts with them. And the penalties that the Chinese government issues if you employ people without a contract are insane. So we now have to rush to get a contract for these workers. If we fire them without a contract, it's worse than if we terminate them with one. So this is information you should have normally, but most companies don't, in my experience. So it's important to start getting it, so that allows you, when you call someone like me, to say that we have a problem because we need to worry about our cash flow, or we're worried about our employees, termination, or we want to change this or that. I'm going to ask you for information, and if you don't have it and you're suddenly getting it from the plant, they're wondering why now, like, why do you need that now? You can also verify. You can have outside auditors go in. We do that very frequently too, and we, depending on how forthcoming we want to be about the purpose of that, sometimes it's very open about, we're coming in to look at these things. Other times it's, we've got to do 3 supplier audits and we just chose you guys, so we're sending somebody in, don't worry about it, kind of thing. Operations procedures. Your operations procedures and theirs, but mostly yours. Because in my experience, American companies are loath to write really full operating procedures. We have ISO. ISO is not operating procedures. ISO is written in that legalese language, and it sits in a book on somebody's shelf, and you update it occasionally, and it's there in case you need it, but that's not how you run your business, right? Operating procedures are how you run your business. Should a key employee, win the lottery, get hit by a truck, whatever, how would you train the next person? In many, 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 many cases, we do not have that kind of information readily available. So it's look at your own first. Chinese companies, Chinese cultural behavior in business tends to be much more directive. So they're typically looking for more details about exactly what should I do and how should I do my job. And I expect my supervisor to tell me that. So you can often find more direction and detail about work on the Chinese side than you can on the US side, but oftentimes they're not connected to each other. They are in contradiction to each other. One is more, is looser, the expectations are different. We have changes in management, and so previous management gave them this type of procedure to use, and that's not what you want, and you didn't even know they had a procedure. One of the other things that I find, another reason why many companies don't have the written operating procedures they need to have, is what I call the Superman syndrome. Superman is that woman or guy that when you can't get something done and your partners in Asia, they fly over, right? You fly Superman over. And Superman goes over and fixes everything, or hopefully, right? Not always, but spends a week or 2 weeks and works on that R&D project, or troubleshoots the quality problems, or helps the distributor understand, your value proposition for that product, whatever it is. Superman isn't going anywhere right now. You can't send Superman, right? So that really exposes where we have weaknesses in our operating procedures that we've just been plugging all this time with these different fixes. So this is an excellent time to look at that. And this is a big part of the projects that we've been doing in the last couple of months, is this, revamping and strengthening operating procedures that work in both the US business culture and the Chinese business culture, and allow for that type of communication, not just we rely on email communication of I'm going to ask and you're going to answer me. I don't want to overcomplicate things, but in many circumstances, having a form is much better. Everybody knows the form needs to be filled out. It forces people to follow a particular procedure before they go about doing something. It gives you all of the information you need about that order, or whatever the situation is. So there's a lot of companies, again, that have raised their business in the US up over 30 years or 50 years or 70 years, and a lot of this stuff just isn't written down. So it's not written down here, it's not written down there. This can be solved with documents, it could be processes, it could be people. Maybe you have a people issue, you don't have the right people in the right place. Can we train them? Can we change them? Can we move responsibilities around? It's a really good time to look at this. I know it's difficult to step back and take the time to do it, but it's important to do. So recapping, I'm going kind of quickly here today. Steps to secure your supply chain: increase your inspection criterion. And this is one of the third-party outside objective measures that you use. So let's say that typically you've been working with the same partner for 10 years, and you typically they do in-house inspections, and they send you their inspection reports, and you do occasional inspections when the goods arrive here in the US. No matter what, don't wait for there to be a problem. You need to start asking for an in-process inspection when the production is being run. You need to increase your finished goods inspection, pre-shipment inspection. You need to change your AQLs so that you have more a higher level of security over the inspection. So if before your AQL was leveled at, they would pull 5 pieces out of every 1,000, then right now you may have to be 20 pieces out of every 1,000 or 50 pieces out of every 1,000. So you want to be much more hands-on about the quality and the inspection than you have been, because if they're relying on alternative suppliers, if their suppliers are not being well run right now, if their ability to get materials is on and off, if maybe they were using a sub-supplier to assemble a certain component and now they've taken that in-house to keep their factory busy because their business is down, are they capable of doing that? Do they have the right equipment? Do they have the right testing equipment? Do they have the right staff training? And they may not have shared all of that with you because they're confident that the product's going to be as good in the end. So you really need to increase your concern level for everything around inspection. And if you haven't used third-party inspectors, this is not a bad time to start. And again, you can tell your partner in Asia, hey, I'm sorry, but our customers or our banks or whoever told us that, we need to increase our inspection criterion right now. So it's not about your trusting them. It's this third party who's making your life difficult, which is why you have to ask them to change things. Use indirect information gathering and verify everything. So if you've got one document that has their inventory, raw material inventory, and then you've also got some financial information with the total value in inventory, or what they've been producing over the last few weeks and how that inventory number should have changed, and it's not changing, and that's a problem. Now, I know that it sounds like I'm telling you to remotely manage someone else's business, and in a way I am. But we are not in a position right now to tolerate a lot of disruption. If you were in a position before where you had, containers coming over every week, and if 1 week's shipment of containers had faulty goods in them, you were a week out because next week you get another shipment. Well, we're not in that same situation right now. So you really need to do that extra work here because it's an investment in not doing the extra work in repairing or fixing whatever that problem is. If you don't have staff in China, it's not a bad time to reach out to people that do have staff on the ground and utilize them. I'm able to do that with my business. There are other people that you may know that have staff in China outside third-party quality control firms. Whether it's checking on the health of a customer, checking on your supplier, your own factory, sending someone in because you normally go every couple of months and you can't right now. So having someone else on the ground go meet with them and explain something because you're concerned it would be complicated, whatever it is, it's a good time. That wonderful saying, trust and verify. You want to be behaving in a trusting way. This is your partner. You respect them. You want them to respect you. You want to maintain a good relationship, but you also need to verify what's going on because everyone's under a lot of stress and strain, financial, practical, emotional right now. So it's important to make sure you have that information. Be a good partner, not a schmuck, right? If you can help with financing, if you can extend terms to your partners in China, that's fabulous, and this may be a good time to do that, but not if they're sinking, right? And again, that's where the third-party information comes in. If they ask you to increase your prepayment amount because they've got cash flow issues and they need more money to buy raw materials from their customers, from their suppliers, that's great. You're happy to help with that, hopefully. You're in a position to, but what's their real financing? What's their real health of the business right now? And what are the chances you can get that money back? China doesn't treat prepayments the way the US does. In the US, if I were to make even an intercompany transaction, if I were to make a prepayment for goods and then you weren't able to ship me those goods, I can convert that to a loan. We can sign loan agreements and loan documents, and that's a loan. Especially when the money's moving across borders. For the Chinese entity to convert a prepayment that you sent over to a loan is next to impossible, especially because that US money came into China and the Chinese government is loath to see the money come back out again. It's one thing to see goods come back out again. It's another thing to see that money come back out again. So again, this one company I was talking about, in addition to, part of their cash flow problem is they had made a prepayment for goods that they were going to use in their facility here in the US, and then they canceled that order, they don't need it. That you would think their CFO assumed that could be treated as an intercompany loan, and it really can't. So they're going to have some type of product shipped back to the US for those goods. And that's something we have yet to resolve. And then finally, my favorite topic of PPE, please don't, please don't. I get every day someone in China, whether they're a digital marketing person or a lawyer or a trading company, every day someone I know in China sends me a message and says, I can get you surgical gowns and masks and whatever. And then I've gotten calls from someone who's friends with the governor of Florida and has been a big donor of his, and we need PPE equipment, and can you help us get it? And then, you know, someone here in Ohio, which is where I live, saying, oh, this hospital needs equipment. What's happening in so many of these cases is that the buyers are throwing this out here and asking hundreds of people, whoever they know and run into, can you get us supplies? And those hundreds of people are asking the hundreds of people that they know who are, and then on China, you have the same situation. You have all of these people who have a college friend or a high school friend or a neighbor who knows somebody or comes from a city that their cousin works for this mask company or works for this gown company. And they tell them, yeah, you guys, you know someone in the US, you know people in Europe, you try, this is the Chinese side now. You know people in the US, you know people in Europe. If you know anybody that wants to buy this stuff, I can help them. So everybody on both sides that, you know, cha-ching, cha-ching, cha-ching is ringing in their brain. Wow, this guy knows someone who knows someone at the hospital, and I know someone who knows someone in China. You know, and by the time you get through all these someones, number one, it's way too expensive and it takes way too long for the information to go back and forth. And one of these guys in China, who's a great guy, he's a travel agent actually in Henan province that I've done some work with, and I've known him for 10 years. He started sending me 5 weeks ago. I have a friend who's at this factory and they're licensed and they're FDA and they can get stuff. And I'm like, okay, send me what you have. Send me the information, right? Send me the certificates. And I checked it all online and I didn't do anything with it, but I checked it online on the US FDA website and it checked out. And a week or two later, he said, oh, I'm so angry. I found out that that guy's not true. Probably using someone else's legitimate FDA certificate. He's like, but I found another company. Here's all the pricing. Here's the information on this company. I'm like, okay. I don't do anything with it here in the US. A week later, he sends me another email. He's like, oh, that guy really lied to me. This is a terrible business, but I have a new one. This guy's legitimate. I know for sure. Guess what happens next week? The next week, it's the same thing. Oh my God, I can't believe it. That guy wasn't honest and it wasn't good and da, da, da. But this one I found is really good. And then next week, guess what happens again? So this has happened every week for 5 weeks. And what I want to say to you is, if you don't know import, export, inside, outside, upside down, if you don't have a team that can go to the factory and sit in their plant and somebody that knows auditing supply chain like insanely well, then I wouldn't touch it with the 10-foot pole. I told the guys representing or saying they were representing the governor, what you need to do with the manufacturer in China, with the supposed manufacturer in China, is say, I want to see shipping documents from 2019 and 2018 of you shipping those exact same SKUs that you're going to sell me in PPE to exporting them to various companies around the world. So I want to see export documents. I want to shipping documents. You can hide the price. I don't care. Right? But I want proof that you've been in this business, and then I can validate those shipping records against open information that's available on what's come into the US or what's gone into Europe by that shipper. Now I can see that this is a legitimate company or not. Because if they don't have those kind of records, then they're not who they say they are, right? And anyone that's trying to sell you in the first place, the legitimate manufacturers in China of PPE have more orders than they can take for the next 2 years. They don't need any new customers. They don't need any new business. So anyone that's trying to convince you they have stock is a middleman. Guarantee you 100% a middleman. And they're making the highest bid. And if someone else outbids them from this factory, and they're probably paying somebody off to get bumped up in the queue to get the product for you. So you're paying top dollar and you're running the risk that you may not get your order anyways. So it's a messy business and I seriously do not recommend it. So this is my name and my business name, my phone number. Email is always the best way to get hold of me, or send me a message on LinkedIn. And I thank you very much for your attention. Julia, do you have any questions that anyone has for me? Or
So we don't have any questions in the chat box yet. I want to go ahead and open up the floor. If anyone that's been in attendance has any questions for Kim, now would be the perfect time to ask. Let's see. Anybody?
They're quiet out there.
You can type your question into the, I'm gonna unmute. And anybody who wants to submit a question can submit a question. You can raise your hand.
I'll say while you're working on that, people ask how long this will go on, and I think that it's so hard to say right now because different countries are going to have new peaks and valleys, and so everything may be working well between Vietnam and the U.S., and then suddenly the U.S. or Vietnam has another problem or slow down or shut down, and things go south. There may be other countries that spike up suddenly and are fully open and start buying a lot of goods. And so those manufacturers are shipping and focusing on that area because our economy's not back up yet. So then when you want to start to get goods, you may be battling with Australia for goods,
Yes.
buying, selling.
So we do have some questions in the chat.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, Kim. If you want to go ahead and finish that thought.
Nope, go ahead.
I have a question from Eric, who says, what's your view on Europe? Which is a broad question, but if you have any insight into that.
On what's going on with the virus and everything in Europe?
I guess would the processes with supply chain and the same type of hiccups, are they occurring in Europe right now, I would assume?
Yeah, what we're seeing a lot in Europe is again, it's very regional. So you're having the same kind of problems. You've got, Italy is starting to open up a little bit with France and some countries that are nearby. But even within countries, some regions or cities are still being locked down. So I think it's going to be region by region, and it's also going to be very fluid. Germany's has opened more. The UK the rates in the UK are very high right now, so they're still fairly shut down. But I don't know that right now. I think you need to look at multiple news sources every day and see in the markets that you're involved in, what's the government's policy on travel and trade in those markets would be my recommendation.
Okay. And a follow-up to that, he said, what about companies exporting from Asia via Europe to the US?
Well, I think Europe and Asia, it's the same situation. They're still restricting travel. It's not really. The only areas that I've heard of creating what they're calling this bubble is Australia and New Zealand, where they're going to allow more travel and trade freely between those two markets and countries. Right now, Asia's locked down with everyone. A lot of the Asian countries are locked down with everyone, and European countries may be opening up with their neighbor bordering countries one by one, but they're not necessarily saying, okay, everybody from India or China or Vietnam can come in, internationally. And I don't know that they're going to do that anytime soon, because they're in kind of the same situation we are, where, the virus started in China. So there's this concern of releasing or relaxing restrictions with China. So I think you have to, it's time consuming and it's tedious, but every day or 2 days or whenever you're facing these questions, you're going to have to, or have news alerts that, that if you have an app that can do that updates you on news alerts on what news is coming out of the countries in particular that you're interested in about their ports and their trade and the travel restrictions, and see what those updates say. I wish I could give you better information, but I can't.
Okay, great. And then we have a question from Jeff Price, who says, what is your assessment on the volume of exports from China / Southeast Asia over the next year? Do you have a time frame for back to normal?
Yeah, I think it's difficult because a lot of that's demand driven. So it depends on how much, our country's demand rebounds. So if we take supply and demand out of it, if we were to rebound to 100%, and China was to, and Asia and Vietnam manufacturing were to rebound to 80, 90, 100%, I would say there's still going to be a 3-month lag of the logistics chain coming back into full swing, because it's going to take time for the vessels and the planes to get back into rhythm and to open the airspace and to open the ports and get, you know, people back into place of where they need to be. And then if you add into that, you know, our demand could be lower, their demand could be lower. So if you add in the supply demand effect of it, then I think you're going to see that it could take 6 months or a year. And a lot of it depends on how quickly, if this virus is mutating, how quickly we get to the point where we're not seeing, you know, continued spikes of illness. I don't know.
Yeah.
That's the
Crystal.
best I can say.
And then we have a question from Pablo. Hello, Kim. What is your opinion about sourcing from Alibaba and other portals available?
Alibaba, AliExpress, Tmall, whatever e-commerce platform in China you can use. Again, it's trust and verify. So in my experience on Alibaba, if you take I oftentimes, if I ever use it for anything, I don't look at the first 3 pages that come
Yeah.
up. I look, you know, loosely, but then I look at pages 4, 5, and 6, because the first 3 are typically paying to be up there. And a lot of times they're trading companies. They're trading companies masquerading as manufacturers. And a lot of times I've had clients say to me, I found this trading company in China, I've been going, or factory, manufacturer. They say they're the manufacturer. I've been going back and forth with them. They've got me the samples, you know. And I said to the guy, typically, if they speak really good English and they're giving you great pricing on a commodity type product, they're not the manufacturer. They're a trading company that deals with 20 manufacturers, which is not a bad thing, right? If they're providing added value to quality inspect your product at the real factory and to provide the English language conversation back and forth, then that may be worth having that trading company markup, right? But you want to know who you're dealing with. So I had this happen with a company a few months ago, and they said, no, we're dealing with the manufacturer. And I said, So we can do like an online check that's pretty quick and inexpensive, or we can actually send someone out there. So we did an online check and we came back and said, nope, trading company. And we don't know, and the person I asked is in that industry, that I asked subcontracted this work to is in that industry. She knows who their factories are. So she was able to say they're a trading company and these are the factories they would normally use for this kind of business. And then at that, we were able to, you know, validate that for him. And then he wanted us to go visit both the trading company and the factory, which were actually, you know, the difference between Florida and Minnesota distance. So we went and did that. So, you know, you want to be careful, you want to be cautious, you want to understand that, again, it's the aspirational lying. There are also a lot of, and that doesn't mean those trading companies aren't good companies. There's a lot of Chinese factories and trading companies that I know that are on Alibaba, and they're good, reliable businesses and partners because it's a legitimate way for them to find customers. So that doesn't invalidate that it's a good way to find product. But you should have a good system for bringing in your first samples, counter samples, inspections, change orders. You know, if they need to change something because they can't get a raw material, if you change something, do you get another first article to review on inspection? You know, what processes are you using? You need to have really robust procedures, especially in this environment where you can't go visit these manufacturers. And I was speaking somewhere a couple of years ago, and at the beginning, it was on this similar topic. And at the beginning, I looked at the audience because someone had just asked me something. I looked at the audience and I said, if you're going to come up to me and start complaining about that factory in China that cheated you and lied to you, and then you're going to tell me you've never been there, you've never met them in person, I don't want, you know, la, 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 I don't want to hear it. I don't want to hear it. You or someone that represents you, before you do any significant amount of business with this company, somebody or you need to have met them, need to have gone there, need to visit the plant, need to look in their eyes and understand who you're doing business with. Because that is the only way to make sure that you are going to have a good working relationship with them over time. Probably more than you wanted to know, but
Yeah, no, that's great information. We have another question from Larry. Assuming lead times have increased, are you seeing any trends in lot size requirements being placed by suppliers?
Yes. In terms of MOQs, do you mean MOQs on your orders, Larry? I think he does. I'm going to answer that, assuming that's what you mean. It can be, especially in PPE or anything that's a hot commodity. If they're increasing MOQs, there's a reason for that, right? It's either because they've got a lot of business and they're trying to weed out some of their smaller customers that aren't ordering in optimum quantities. It's because maybe they have a raw materials supplier problem. So maybe previously they were able to buy open stock materials, to satisfy what you needed because it's a nut or a bolt or something, or it's a type of fabric that's commonly produced and it's very similar across manufacturers. And they were able to go out and buy small quantities of it. And now they've got to actually custom order that fabric or custom order those, those nuts and bolts. And so because of their suppliers' MOQs, they might have to give you now MOQs. A worrisome reason would be that they're subcontracting, and their subcontractor needs to have a larger quantity. They have financial issues and they just can't, keep their factory going if they don't have more consistent, larger orders. So you want to try to understand if there's a sudden change in that, where there's an increase in MOQ, where is that change coming from? What's driving it? Because that helps you understand the health and status of their business.
Thanks, Kim. Another question is, do you think the market is shifting from the USA, less China imports and more other country imports? Market is shifting.
Meaning there's more of the imports coming into the US are coming from other countries instead of China?
Yes, I believe that's the question, yes.
I would say that because of the trade war to start with, that started to happen. And so, but the problem is, people, this is a very the indirect question you're asking is there a replacement for China? And that's something people have been asking me for probably 10 years. And my answer has been not really. Because Vietnam is the size of California, so you can't replace the United States with California on a manufacturing standpoint. It just doesn't have the population, it doesn't have the resources, it doesn't have the breadth and volume of manufacturing in different kinds of industries and businesses. And a lot of so one of my clients here in the US was pushing their team in China to say, you need to find us suppliers in Vietnam. And those guys know me, the Chinese know me. So like, hey, Kim, do you know any suppliers in Vietnam? So I reached out to my contacts in Vietnam, and guess what? The Vietnamese suppliers are there and they're competitive, but their raw materials come from China. So because they couldn't get raw materials from China, they were pretty much out of business too. So, within Asia, there's really not a country that is in a position to replace China. Some industries have been moving already. Food industry moved quite a while ago. Rubber gloves haven't been really made in China for very long. They're mostly Indonesia and some other markets. Africa clothing has been Bangladesh and Laos and some of those countries for quite a long time, more than China is. Electronics are going into Vietnam to some extent, but again, a lot of those raw materials still come from China for the finished goods that are being made in Vietnam. South America, most South America, and this is a broad brush, so forgive me, but most South American countries, Colombia is somewhere you wouldn't go 10 years ago, and now Colombia is like safe and fabulous and doing really well, and Venezuela is a hot mess. And Brazil is, kind of does the same thing every decade or so, it seems to be. And then Africa is starting to become an opportunity. But both in Africa and India, you have major infrastructure issues, and a lot of Southeast Asia for that matter. You have major infrastructure issues. You don't have the roads, the electrical, supply, the industries. You don't, you have a lot of graft and theft in India and Africa, the way China was 25, 30 years ago and hasn't been in the last decade or so. So it's really not, you can't just move it. If we could have moved it, they'd have moved it 10 years ago or 5 years ago, they'd have moved it. So in that sense, we're not at that point yet. I do think that some countries in Africa are going to get closer. I think Vietnam is improving, as every few years. I was just there last year again, and it's better systems than were in place before, but it's still, bribery is still a major issue. Vietnam is very similar to China. It's difficult to open a business. It's difficult to get money out of the country. The labor laws are very employee centered, so it's more difficult to employ and terminate people in Vietnam and China than it is in the US, which a lot of American companies don't understand. So yes, we are seeing things move. I think where the biggest overall shift is going to be, and I've seen this in some of my clients even 5 years ago, that your China operation supplies Asia and maybe some goes to Europe and the US. Your Mexico plant supplies the US and Central America. You have a plant in Poland that supplies Poland and Europe. I think we're going to regionalize. And for companies that have the size and the bandwidth to do that, that's great, right? Because then when these logistics disruptions occur, travel disruptions occur, you're less affected. If you've got 3 plants in 3 regions and one region's having trouble, you can backfill from another plant in a different region if you have to, but one plant that feeds the whole world, we may not see something like that going forward. I think companies are going to be very hesitant to plan around that kind of an outcome. But that doesn't mean if you have a plant in Mexico, a plant in China, and a plant in Poland that you're going to have the same cost structure, that you're going to have the same supply chain, you're going to have the same quality, that you can even have the same type of operations, in each country. So because of what their labor laws are, or other circumstances around doing business. But I do think regionalization, I would say, is the one big broad trend that I see coming forward.
Great. Thank you so much, Kim. Guys, we are out of time. We've covered a lot of ground today. Kim, if you wouldn't mind putting that last slide up that has your contact information available.
Sure. Let me.
Got it. Let's see.
Do you see it? And it's Kimberly Kirkendall, Kirkendall, and you can find me on LinkedIn. You can send me a message. And then Julia has, the rest of my contact information. And I think the slides will be shared. So
they will. Absolutely. So guys, the slides are going to come to you. The recording's going to come to you. And then we had some questions about further information and different types of webinars. If you would like to see Kim come back to speak about something specific in that survey, be sure to let us know. And then if there's anything else related to international trade that you'd like to see, please indicate in that survey what you're looking for, and we'll do our best to get that type of content out to you. Again,
and on that subject, we do China bank and financing and financial transactions as a common. VAT tax, which I didn't talk about today, is very important to understand. Yes. And so those are like some regulatory China FDA, CCC, those kind of things. That's another topic. So anything like that you guys are interested in, let us know.
Fabulous. All right, guys, you'll get that survey. You're going to get the follow-up recording and PowerPoint. Kim, thank you so much for all this great information. And with that, we're going to go ahead and wrap up for today.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.